Hello, I'm Marder, and I'm the moderator for today's session. And I was chosen for this because I'm one of the deputy editors for eLife. That is to say, I'm one of the people who is playing a role in oversight of eLife, which, as you know, is a new peer-reviewed open access journal. And we hope that all of you will take advantage of the many wonderful attributes of eLife to submit your best papers to us. Just a brief note about me. I'm a professor at Brandeis University. I am a neuroscientist, and over the years, I've had a large number of graduate students and postdocs work in my lab, so I've been on the submitting side of NIH postdoctoral, predoctoral fellowships, as we'll call them. I also, at one point, served on NINDS Council. That's the council for one of the neuroscience institutes at NIH. And so I was sort of seeing the other side of it. And I'm a program director for a postdoctoral training grant, which comes from, or T32, which comes from the NIH. So I have a fair bit of experience relevant to this webinar. Now, as I understand it, this webinar came about partially at the request of, or a suggestion of our 14 early career advisors. These are mostly postdocs who are a group of people that eLife asks for advice and ideas about how to best serve the young community or the beginning science community. And eLife is very, very attuned to trying to foster the careers of young scientists or beginning scientists. So this is just one of many efforts that eLife tries to provide. Now, we're going to be focusing on the NIH's fellowship programs. In general, these are called NRSA programs, and they come in two flavors, and some of you may already have experience with one or the other of them. One flavor that we're not going to spend much time talking about is the T32. These are institutional NRSA programs, and these are written by faculty members at your institutions. They're competitively reviewed, and some of you will be funded from these usually early in your career or various times in your careers. But you're only funded through the institution because of the faculty efforts. And those are evaluated according to your excellence and the training. The programs where we're going to be focusing our attention today are the individual NRSAs, and these come in two flavors, the F31 and the F32. The F31 is intended for predoctoral students. These are graduate students and PhD programs around the country. And the F32s are individual postdoc fellowships. And the next slide, I think. Just to put things right on track, to be eligible for funding from the NRSA program, you have to be a U.S. citizen or have a green card, and we'll talk more about that later. And the little less understood piece is that as a graduate student, you have a total of 5 years of eligibility either through the T32 program or the F31 program, so that if you're funded for 2 years on the T32, you can apply for 3 more on the F31 program, or vice versa. At the postdoctoral level, you have a total eligibility of 3 years. So if you're on a T32, a postdoctoral training grant for 1 year, you're only eligible for another 2 years from the F32. And that's just something to get sort of straight ahead of time. I'm going to be joined today with two very wonderful compatriots in all of this. Dr. Henry Khachaturian is presently, what's most relevant for today, he's presently the Training Program Policy Officer for the Division of Biomedical Research Workforce at the NIH. So he basically is in charge of all these training programs, and he previously had served as training program directors at NIH and NINDS. And then our last panelist is Sam McKenzie, who is a first-year postdoc now at NYU, who has just gone through the process of applying for and being awarded an F-32. So we have, a direct individual who actually has managed to persevere through the whole process of getting an F-32. Now, we're going to be talking about this in much greater detail as we move along, but I just want to say right up front, before I eventually turn things over to Henry and Sam, first, the most important thing that you should know is to apply for either an F-31 or an F-32. You need a project, you need an advisor, and you usually need some preliminary data. These are training programs that are a combination of training to do individual mentored research as well as being trained in a field. And so those two components, real new learning training components and a research project, have to be combined in these. I don't remember what else. What's the next slide show? Can I have, okay. And Sam will talk about this later, but I just want to say for those of you, redundancy is sometimes very important. This proposal is non-trivial and takes time to develop. You can't knock it off in 3 days. It really takes a fair bit of thought. There are 3 review cycles per year, and the review is by study sections funded by council of one of the NIH institutes. And Henry can talk more about the details of that if it becomes relevant to anything. And then I think, is that more or less the end? What's the next slide, please? Next slide. Yes. So at this point, I'm going to turn the platform over to Henry to really talk in more detail about these programs and to walk you through the kinds of opportunities that are available through the NIH for individual training. Henry, it's all yours.
Thank you, Eve. Hello, everyone. From this slide, you may remember just one thing, my email address, hk11b@nih.gov, and that's all you need to know. You can send me an email or send an email to eLife. We will provide these slides for you if you would like to. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these slides. As you've mentioned, we would like to answer all of your questions. So if you can go to the next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah, thank you. So the thing to remember from this talk, most of all, is that NIH is not a single organization. It's National Institutes of Health. There are 27 different institutes and centers, and each have their own specific program priority, and as well as training and career development priority. So not every institute supports all of the programs that other institutes support. Next slide. This just shows you that NIH is made up of multiple organizations. This next slide shows the overall NIH budget. Next, I have highlighted 2 pieces here for you. The Research Training Awards, thank you. The Research Training Awards and Career Development Awards. These together add up to about $1.4 billion of the NIH funds. So it's a lot of funding that goes to our training and career development programs. Next slide, please. A few tips in terms of applying for NIH, and these are very important take-home points. You need to understand the priorities and goals of each of the institutes and centers. As I mentioned previously, they are not the same, so it is important to call us and find out. Learning about the application and peer review process is also very important. There are courses that are offered by your university or by professional societies that you may want to attend to better understand both the application and review process. Identifying specific programs to apply to. As some of you may know, there is an NIH guide for grants and contracts where we list all of our different programs and fellowships and training programs and career development awards are among these. Making early contact with us. I would say at least 3 months ahead of time when your application is due, you want to start planning your application. And one of those steps should be talking to a program officer at the NIH. You may start by an email, introduce yourself, introduce your project, then get a hold of us, talk to us about whether your research fits a particular institute or it should be assigned to another institute. It goes without saying that innovative, well-respected, and I would add well-funded mentors and collaborators, because the NRSA, the National Research Service Awards, provide funds, and we'll talk about what those funds are, but they don't provide a lot of funds for research. So you have to have collaborations, particularly with mentors that are well-funded. Studying successful applications. Sam will talk about his own experiences, but I would encourage you to look at other applications that are successful and interact with those individuals in terms of how they went through the process. Young investigators propose sometimes a lot of their ideas, so it is not a bargain to propose 10 specific aims for the price of one fellowship. So think about what is important to you, what your passion is in terms of research, and propose those ideas, maybe 1 or 2 or 3 specific aims at the most. Next slide, please. Okay, this is our brand new website, which we launched back in August. It is organized, as you can see at the bottom of the slide, with specific career stage. And I would invite you to visit this site. Hopefully by 2 or 3 clicks, you should be able to get to the program that is of most interest to you. Next slide. I have selected very few, that is 4 of these different career stages for this purpose. Of course, we are going to focus on only the pre-doctoral and post-doctoral phases, but here I wanted to show you the full spectrum of programs that NIH offers beginning investigators and even established investigators. Next slide, next click. So these are a variety of different programs designated by activity codes or mechanisms. For example, at the very left hand, you can see T32, T35, et cetera, et cetera. So these are the various programs that we offer at the various stages of career development. Next click, please. We also have a variety of other kinds of programs that help investigators, for example, loan repayment program, particularly for clinicians who have loan debt. Next slide. As I mentioned, we're going to focus on the pre-doctoral and post-doctoral training periods, and here we're going to focus on a little bit on the training programs, but mostly on the fellowship programs. Next slide, please. So the National Research Service Awards, or the renamed Ruth Kirschstein National Research Service Awards, there are 2 types of these, institutional training programs and individual fellowships. As Eve mentioned, we're not going to dwell very much on the institutional programs. These are programs that faculty applies for, and you may be selected to be appointed on the program. Individual fellowships are those that you actually apply for directly. You have to be working towards your dissertation research, and you also have to have an experienced mentor, and I would add a well-funded mentor to apply for one of these. Next slide. Now, some common features of NRSA awards. Generally, they require full-time commitment. However, remember that full-time is defined by your institution and not by NIH's 40 hours per week. That's our legal definition of full-time. One other thing that I would like you to remember is that the NRSA budget is highly structured. There's a set amount of funds that are going to come to you. They are by no means intended to cover the entire cost of your fellowship. So, for example, stipends are not equivalent to salaries. They're subsistence allowance to defray costs of living. So do not compare them to salaries at your institution. NRSA also pays for partial tuition and fees. We also pay what's called an institutional allowance or training-related expenses. These are primarily to cover health insurance, some research supplies, equipment, etc., but again, not enough to cover your entire research budget. Next slide, please. The training programs, as we mentioned, are for institutions that have a experienced program director and faculty to serve as mentors. There are two varieties. One is the general T32 long-term or at least 2 or 3 years of training. We also have a short-term training program. You may want to ask your mentor in terms of availability of these programs. These are primarily targeted to medical students to devote some time to research during the summer months. These awards are restricted to institutions in the United States, and trainees must be citizens or permanent residents, as Eve mentioned. There is 5 years of eligibility for the pre-doctoral stage of training. That eligibility is extended to 6 years if you're applying for a dual degree program, and I'll mention that in a second. And training can be in basic clinical or behavioral sciences. Next slide, please. So there are 2 individual fellowships at the pre-doctoral level. One is the F30, which is the dual degree training. These are dual research and clinical doctoral degree training, such as MD PhD or DDS PhD or DMD PhD. There's a variety of dual clinical and doctoral training, research doctoral training programs out there. The requirement is that you be matriculated no more than 48 months. That's 4 years prior to initiation of the application. And half of your time, 50% of your effort has to be spent on the research component. So this award uniquely also supports the clinical component of the training, but it cannot exceed more than 50%. The F31 is the more popular award. These are primarily for research doctoral degrees such as the PhD. But you have to be at the dissertation stage to qualify for one of these awards. We also have another program called Diversity F31. These are for individuals from diverse backgrounds, and of course that only applies to US populations. The NRSA fellowships, unlike our training programs, can be had, or you can apply to, from a domestic institution or from a foreign institution. So both are applicable. Next slide, please. Okay, at the postdoctoral level, you can see that we have a variety of career development awards, but I'm going to focus on the training and fellowship grants right in the center. Next slide. The training programs that are awarded to institutions at this stage have very specific requirements, and that is to provide a strong foundation for research design methods, analytical techniques for the postdocs that are being trained to help them become independent scientists. So it's a little bit different from the pre-doctoral institutional training program. Next slide, please. I want to spend some time talking to you about the postdoctoral fellowship. These are very competitive for very promising applicants that are doing postdoctoral research under guidance of a outstanding faculty member with funding. Fellows must have a clinical research or clinical doctoral degree. And they must work towards independence. So these fellowships are not for continuation of the postdoc. So you may be proposing to do research, for example, on your mentor's R01 grant, but we want to know if there's an added value to you when you're applying for a fellowship. So it cannot be more of the same. It has to be something that is uniquely yours, or you are collaborating with your mentor, something that at the end of your training you will take with you to the next stage. So as we say, training should facilitate your transition to the next stage of your career. That next stage may be continuing your postdoc, doing some new project, or moving on to a faculty position. Next slide, please. Here are the NRSA predoctoral and postdoctoral stipends. You can see the predoctoral stipend is at $22,920. Our postdoctoral stipends start at almost $43,000 and go to $56,000 depending on the years of experience. So a newly minted PhD at 0 months will have a stipend at level 0. And individuals who are 6 years postdoc will have a stipend beginning at $54,000. One thing I want to mention about stipend levels, most of our postdocs have stipend levels in year 0, 1, or 2. Levels 3, 4, 5, and 6 are really reserved for individuals who are maybe doing something new as a continuation of postdoc, or clinicians that have several years of clinical experience post-MD or post-clinical degree that are coming into a research career. So they start with the higher stipend levels. Next slide, please.
Before you go on, can I just chime in one thing?
Yes, please. Yes, please do.
So you'll notice that the predoctoral stipend is listed at $22,920. That's considerably less than many graduate programs in this country are now paying. The important thing is that these NIH stipends can be supplemented by non-federal funds. So if you get a predoc at $23,000, as shown there, but the stipend level in your graduate program is $30,000, your graduate program will find some way to supplement the $23,000 provided by the NIH to the graduate program level. And there are a variety of different ways this happens. But I think it's very important for you to realize that you won't be taking a drop in pay, or you shouldn't take a drop in pay if you're awarded one of these very competitive fellowships. Likewise, the postdoc stipends can be supplemented, again, by non-federal funds if the institution allows it.
Thank you, Eve. Remember that these, again, to reemphasize that these are not salaries, so don't compare them with salaries. For example, if you're a postdoc, don't compare it with a salary of your fellow postdoc down the hall that's working on an R01 grant. This is a subsistence allowance. It does not have fringe benefits associated with it. So talk to your mentor, to your Office of Postdoctoral Affairs, Dean, or Office of Sponsored Research in terms of your institution's policies on postdoctoral compensation. Next slide, please. And I think that's the last slide. I have a few websites for you that you might find of interest. The first one is the different NIH institutes and centers, so you can read about the differences among them. There are grant and funding opportunities, link to NIH training opportunities. And then moving down, forms and applications where you can apply to, whether it's a training grant, fellowships, or a career development award. How to apply to NIH electronically, grants and policy guidelines. This is more for your administrators than you. but also, most importantly, at the bottom, NIH Guide for Grants and Contracts, where we list all of our training programs. That is the end of my talk, and I think we will now turn over to Sam to give you his perspective on applying for and getting a fellowship.
Well, thank you, Henry. So yeah, I have in the past applied for the F31 grant when I was doing my doctoral degree, and I just recently started my postdoc and applied for the F32. And I want to reiterate something that Eve said earlier, which is just the time commitment involved in putting one of these grants together. So I actually applied even before joining the lab, and it was at least 2 weeks of work, and that was the only thing that I was doing, was putting together the materials for this grant. There's many sections, and I had naively thought before going into the process that the most important aspect would have been exactly the research plan being proposed, but there's another important element, which is what is your training potential. And so this gets into something that Henry mentioned a couple of times, which is picking a mentor, which is going to really benefit your overall training and complement your previous training that you have during your doctoral degree to kind of make you a well-rounded scientist coming out of your postdoctoral research. So maybe I'm happy to talk specifically about my experience, but maybe this could be better done even through just asking specific questions from the audience.
Well, maybe before we do that, you could just very briefly run through all the different pieces of the proposal, because there are lots of them.
Sure. Yeah. So I'd say that there's, aside from basically filling out your demographic information, there's about 10 or 11 different sections, at least for the F32 proposal. And so the first thing that you really have to do is actually get yourself signed up with the ERE Commons website. And so at least for me, how I did this at my graduate institute and here at NYU was through the grants office. They got me with an ERA Commons login information. And then from there, the next step is making sure that you have your letters of recommendation in place. So contacting your advisor or professors who you're familiar with. And I believe that for the F32, it'd be a maximum of 5 people who are willing to write you letters of recommendation. And then aside from this, there's many sections. So one is a personal bio sketch outlining your previous academics and your research experience. Another one of the sections is the activities planned under the grant. And so this is really an allotment of how your time is going to be spent every year that the grant will cover. And be sure to include in this section the formal mentorship time, as well as obviously the research and any courses. So another one of the sections is describing the equipment and facilities that are available. And so here, I think this only matters if you don't have it. So just be sure to do some research as to what kind of microscopes and computer systems and surgeries and suites and things like this. So another one of the sections, research and career goals. And so here the way that I took this section was stating at what point of my career am I in right now, very briefly, and then saying where do I want to go in the future, and making it clear that this grant and this funding opportunity is a necessary step from A to B. Another one of the sections is talking about the responsibility and research training. And so here, the NIH is pretty clear as to what kind of formal training they require you to have. And this is all posted on their website. And so in all likelihood at your institute, this course is available that exactly match to those NIH standards. And so just be sure that you're saying exactly what NIH wants you to do, that this is going to be the training, the responsibility and research training that you're going to be taking within the duration of the grant. Another one of the sections is how you picked your sponsor and how you picked the institute. And again, here they want to see that there's strong training potential. So that either that the research question is complementary to something that you've thought about before, there's a new technique, and that's a well-funded lab so that you're actually going to have the opportunity to succeed in your research. Another one of the sections is a specific aim section of the grant. And so here, I think this is giving the motivation for the entire project with enough detail to give the reader a sense of what you're going to do. And it should be, I think this is the most important page. It should stand alone and not be too technical, motivating the entire project that you're proposing. And then it's the research strategy. And so this is where you actually lay out what you're going to do and how you're going to do it. And I guess here's all I can say is it's extremely clear to lay out what's the overall hypothesis that this line of work is going to do, specifically how you're going to test it. And then if you make one observation, how does this observation relate to your hypothesis, either confirming it or denying it? And all of the while thinking about, how could the project fail? And considering what are those alternative outcomes for the experiments, and just making it clear to whoever's reviewing it that experiments don't always go exactly as planned, and that you've thought about a couple of the different pathways that it could take. And here, especially if you're going to be working with animals or with people, IACUC wants to make sure that you are considering the strain of the animal, the age in which it's going to be testing, in particular the sex of the animal. So there's a new directive to be considering testing both male and female subjects. And so in speaking with my program officer, that was clear that issue is very important to her. And there's even other sections to this grant too. I think the best thing to do to get all of these subsections organized is to have an example of somebody who's previously submitted a grant and has been awarded it, and then just be careful because the specific rules change from year to year. And so with the announcement of the funding opportunity, they make the notes as to what other information might be required. And so it's not always a safe assumption that the documents that were required on previous years be those that are required in future years. But I absolutely want to stress that it's important to look at other grants that have been successfully funded, and I certainly modeled mine after those.
I would just like to sort of end this beginning part of the webinar with a statement that's very, very important. Applying for one of these pre- or postdoctoral NRSAs is absolutely the best thing you can do as a learning exercise in how to write an R grant, that is to say a research grant for the NIH going forward. When we send in our research grants, we go through many of the same, not exactly the same hoops, but many of the same processes. And so I think it's a very, very, very important that people who want to stay in academic science start learning to develop the skills and how to deal with this sort of grant application as early as possible so that you can make the transition to being a successful independent scientist as quickly and as successfully as possible. I think that more or less concludes what we had intended to share with you. And so now it's time for us to go to questions from whoever is out there watching. And I'm trying to see how I figure out, or how we figure out those questions.
I can see the questions coming in now, Eve. And so we've got the first question here, which I think may be directed towards you, which is does eLife publish these postdoctoral positions as hhmi.org does?
I don't fully understand what that means.
So let's say that there's a university with a job opportunity for postdoctoral fellow. Are those job postings published on the eLife website?
Not presently, as far as I know. Next.
And so here we've got another question. Is the postdoctoral fellowship only for U.S. citizens or permanent residents?
Yes.
Yes.
So both, if you're a permanent resident, then you can apply.
Yes.
You can apply. Actually, you can apply. Sometimes if you know you're going to get your permanent residency, within the next, I would say, 9 months, you can actually apply. So at the time of application, this is not a requirement. So when the award is actually activated is when you need to be a permanent resident. So if you can plan ahead, you may be able to apply and then get your permanent residency, get the award activated. So again, think about a 9-month lag from application to award, roughly. Some institutes have an accelerated process where you can get an award within 6 months, but most of the time, you're looking at 9 months from award to application.
Okay, I'm seeing a question about which fellowship award does not require U.S. citizenship, and none of the NIH or NSF training awards that we've covered here is available to non-U.S. citizenship. But I think the K awards, which usually happen, Henry, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe that the K awards, which are for more senior people, are open to non-U.S. citizens.
So let me just offer a slight clarification. The National Research Service Awards, by law, require U.S. citizenship and permanent residency. We do have other fellowships. For example, the Fogarty International Center offers international fellowships. These are F05, and there are others that are open to foreign nationals. So again, talk to us in terms of what each institute supports, and we oftentimes, if you're not eligible for one of the National Research Service Awards, we will refer you to Fogarty International Center for their fellowships and training programs. Career Development Awards are similarly restricted. The only one that currently is not restricted is the K99R00. So you do not have to be a U.S. citizen or permanent resident to qualify for the K99R00, but all the others are restricted.
We have another question here. To what extent is the application judged on the quality of the mentor?
I'll start and then Henry can chime in. The quality of the mentor, I think, will play a significant role, and the quality of the mentor is judged in several dimensions. One is the mentor's prior mentoring experience. So as a mentor, we have to provide data on our prior training record, and that is taken into account. We also have to provide lists of our current and active grant support, and we have to provide lists of our publications. So I think all of those things get used by the study sections in evaluating the quality of the mentor. Henry?
Yeah, two things to keep in mind. Mentors funding and mentors qualifications to provide advice for individuals that are developing their career. So, for example, if your mentor happens to be relatively junior, let's say a just hired assistant professor, and he or she is really the expert in the scientific area that you would like to pursue, and otherwise they do make excellent mentors and they have their research funding. However, they might not have enough experience as a mentor in terms of giving advice to individuals developing their career. You may seek out a more senior individual, more experienced in your department, perhaps a full professor like Dr. Marder, and ask them to be part of your mentoring team. That balances out the experience in mentoring. So those two qualities are very important.
I think there's another middle ground too, which is if there's a particular technique that you want to use, you can actually go and approach a more senior faculty member and just receive a letter and include that letter in the application. And so that's all of this is directly related to the next question that's coming in. If you want to obtain an F-32 with a more junior scientist, what other kind of supplements can you use? And I think co-mentorship or maybe a specific signed letter saying that they would be willing to meet and consult on a particular methodology. Okay, so I'm getting a question here. Did your F-32 get funded on the first try? And if not, what were some of the comments given? And so my F-32 was not funded on the first try. And one of the main comments that was given, so I applied even before I joined the laboratory. And so I actually didn't have any preliminary data that I had collected in my proposal, but I did include preliminary data that had been collected in the lab. And I made it very clear that I did not collect that data myself. And I think that one of the biggest flaws of my first proposal was that I was not very clear in terms of what every observation that I predicted would directly relate to the hypothesis that I was making. And so the major change that I made from the original submission to the resubmission was actually removing information that was not directly related to what I said I wanted to test, and then being very clear that every observation that I would make means one thing or means another. And I think that that's what was the overall strength of the proposal, was that either way the experiment went, it would give some information that would either confirm or deny one of the hypotheses that I had laid out. And I think that there's this balance, in particular when it comes to preliminary data, showing that the project itself is feasible and that you are capable of doing the project. And so I had moved from related fields in my doctoral work and now my postdoctoral work. And so maybe this may have helped the referees in judging that I was capable of doing the research. But at the same time, the first round, they all said to me that I was staying too close into the field of research and that there was not that great of a training potential. And so even though in my second round, I didn't say that propose any different experiments, I made it clear in the introductory page that is required with the resubmission exactly how technically difficult and different the experiments were that I was proposing to do versus what I had done in the past. And also it went to a different committee for review. And so at the first time that it was being reviewed, it was actually with a committee that was not specializing in the kind of work that I do. And the second time I wrote to my program officer and I said, please put it in this other reviewing committee. And it was, they honored that request. I don't know if you have anything to add.
Yeah, I would just like to say that it's a bit, in each case, exactly when you should submit that first application is a little bit a judgment call. And again, Henry's right that you should talk to your program officers. With postdocs who are coming into my lab, if they're coming from very different backgrounds, I usually tell them that maybe they should be in the lab for 6 months before they start writing. So I don't want them to wait 2 years, but sometimes just being in the lab for that first 6 months and seeing how the experiments are done, getting their hands wet, getting going, makes it much more possible for them to write authoritatively in a very different field from where they came from. So I think somewhat it depends on how much of a field change you're making. If you were going from studying the microbiome and people from all over the world into neuroscience, it might be hard to write a proposal to do that before you actually start in the lab. But on the other hand, if you're staying closer to your previous work, you can probably write a definitive proposal a little bit earlier.
So I came down to the lab to present my ideas to the group, and which I think was invaluable feedback that I got from the group. So we have another question here. In comparison to a pre-doctoral fellowship, how do you determine what will be considered too ambitious in terms of experiments proposed within each aim? Certainly, postdoctoral work will allow more time devoted to research, but should the amount of experiments proposed be comparable to an F-31?
So I can take that one initially. The questioner is on the right track, and I agree with you. There is a difference between pre-doc and postdoc. With the pre-doc fellowship, you're closer to what your mentor is doing. You're not as independent. But when it comes to postdoctoral fellowship, you better propose something that either is a variation of what your mentor is working for, or it's entirely your work, or something in between. Sam can speak to this as well, probably better than I can. But in terms of being overambitious, you need to propose something that you can do in the allotted time. So if you're asking for 3 years, you need to think about how much work you can do in those 3 years. What are they leading to? So, for example, overambitious, which is something common, and Eve can speak to this, you're proposing projects that might well and end up to be 5, 6, 7 years. And not doable. The other aspect of the overambitiousness is this something that you are prepared to take on now, or do you need additional training to get into a new area? So you have to be realistic in terms of what you propose and the duration that you're proposing, and does this particular project actually suit your particular training and career development need? Right? So it's not just additional funding to do your research. Again, I would come back to the added value to your training and your career development. Is this something that naturally will lead to, in the postdoc level, will lead to either a career development award or right into a research grant? So that's a postdoctoral fellowship.
So at least the strategy that I chose was to pick an interesting overarching question and then take a little corner of that and not say I'm going to solve this whole huge theoretical issue, but outline some experiments very clearly that are related to this overarching question, but are clearly going to be doable in the amount of time. And I think I erred on the side of safety rather than saying I'm going to solve this whole aspect of the way the nervous system works. Eve, what do you think?
Yeah, I think it's, in a way you can err by being too conservative, because then people will say there's not enough new training potential, or you can err on being way too ambitious. What I usually force people to do is sit down with a pencil and paper and actually try and calculate, if everything were to work out well, how long it would actually take to do each specific experiment in the grant and to add it all up. And when you reach 10 years being proposed for a single postdoc, I just look at them with a sick look, And when I have assistant professors applying for their R1s and I count up all the person years and it hits 150, I say, too ambitious. So, everybody wants our people, we all want our people to be intellectually ambitious, but you lose credibility if you say you're going to do what would take a careful person 20 years to do. So the whole issue in getting a grant at any level is to establish your credibility. And so if you say you're going to do way, way too much, you lose your credibility because people don't think you can actually do that in a high quality, rigorous fashion in the time allotted. So if you just keep that in mind, this is all about establishing your credibility. People don't expect everything to work, but they want to believe that you will know what to do when things don't work. And that's where that credibility issue comes into play.
And to identify the places in the grant where it might not work as you had originally thought, and to imagine what would be the alternative outcomes.
And that's where that credibility issue comes from. What's next?
Now, it's a question, how crucial is picking the right review panel? For example, immunology versus infectious diseases for an F-32.
Henry, that's yours.
So I think, yes, it is. Of course, it is crucial. You want to have that initial conversation with your program officer, not only to determine whether that particular institute is the best suited. For example, with Sam talking with his program officer at NIH and a specific NIH institute and determining whether that's the best place for the application to go, but also asking the program officer, so which study section should this be assigned to? And so you're getting two different pieces of advice here from NIH. You may, after settling on a study section, actually call the scientific review administrator and talk to him or her in terms of whether this project is best suited to that particular study section. Lastly, when you put your application, when you submit your application to NIH, there is something called a cover letter, which is often not utilized by more junior investigators, but more senior investigators do utilize them. They simply say, I have spoken with so-and-so, Henry Khachaturian at such and such institute, and we think that it's best assigned to that institute in a very particular study section. This helps the assignment officers at the Center for Scientific Review to actually assign your application unless they completely disagree with you. They're generally going to assign it to the study section that you are requesting. So doing a little bit of a homework ahead of time is going to save you a lot of headache, just in case, and sometimes this happens, it gets misassigned.
And I followed exactly Henry's advice, and I put that information on the cover letter with my resubmission.
And 90% of the time, that works. 10% of the time, they go wherever.
Mm-hmm.
And you can reroute them, or sometimes you can't. But, the people at NIH are usually trying to help the investigators out. But every now and then, things happen because either they think you don't know best, or because there are things that are sort of other factors that enter into the whole process.
So one of those factors, if I may expand, is that there is overlap in institute missions. So each institute has a mission statement and guidelines for which applications should be assigned to them. And they also have a section that has overlap with other institutes. So for example, neuroscience is supported by 15 different institutes, and there's a lot of overlap. So this is a document that is inside NIH. It does not get released outside, but referral officers at the Center for Scientific Review have access to them. So it's a judgment call sometimes which institute a particular project should be assigned to. But if you've done your homework and made a request, it's better if it's been misassigned. You're better off going back to your program officer or the scientific review administrator and arguing that no, in fact, you're more correct than they are, of course, respectfully. But if you haven't done any of that, if you haven't bothered to at least make a request or a suggestion, then you're kind of at their mercy.
What more questions do we have?
Are graduate students that are performing their predoctoral research at the NIH eligible to apply for an NRSA?
Yes. So both graduate students and postdocs at NIH, both the intramural labs, this is where research is done on NIH campus, and other federal labs are eligible to apply for NRSA.
Next question is, how do you pay for the research since the NRSA only pays for the stipend? Does your sponsor pay for everything? Can you apply for an R21 or R03 to pay for it?
You are correct. This is a good question. NRSA does not pay a lot of research dollars. There may be some under institutional allowance or training related expenses if you're being trained on a training grant, but it is really not enough to cover your research. So you have to have a mentor or a team of mentors or some source of support, either departmental or personal, that is going to fund the research, and that has to be clear in the application. Otherwise, NRSA only covers certain expenses, as I mentioned, and it is not intended to cover 100% of either your stipend or tuition and fees, or your research costs. So picking a mentor that is well-funded, again, we keep emphasizing this, is an important aspect of applying for one of these.
I would like to add to that being a postdoc is a very specific title. That means you're still in training. At most institutions, postdocs are not allowed to submit research grants to the NIH. After you're a postdoc at most institutions, you can become some kind of staff scientist or some other kind of category, which at many institutions would allow you to apply for a research grant, but then you would no longer be eligible for anything on the NRSA funding mechanism. So, the answer is no. If you're on an NRSA, you cannot be the principal investigator on an R grant.
So I will add one curious program that NIH has, and that is we have a dissertation research grant that uses the R36 mechanism. This is available for graduate students who are applying for F31, for example. They can also apply for a R36 dissertation research award to supplement their dissertation work. But that's not a very large program. It's very rarely used.
Got a related question. Can the speakers talk further about the total amount of funding time eligibility? If a postdoc has been on a T32 for 2 years, it seems like a different mechanism might be better than an NRSA for continuation of funding. Is that right? For example, perhaps a K99 award.
So if you have been on a T32, for example, for 2 years, remember the combined aggregate eligibility postdoctoral is 3 years. So if you've been on a T32 for 2, you're eligible for a F32 for 1 year. The question is that sufficient time? Or if you're really want to then go to the next stage of your training, that is transitioning, which is what the Career Development Awards do, you may want to think about one of the Career Development Awards and perhaps even the K99R00 to help you go through that transition period. So the total eligibility is 3 years combined, T32, F32. Under unusual circumstances, that may be extended at the discretion of the program officer, but again, not to finish up your work. If you have a unique opportunity to learn something new, sometimes we will extend it for an additional year. But again, it's very rare.
So we have a few more questions, so I think we're going to run over the time allotted, if that's okay with you, Eve and Henry.
Mm-hmm.
I should try and finish the questions and then wrap up.
Okay. And so the next question, if you're a recipient of a T32 training program as a graduate student with 3 years of support, does this hurt your chances of a postdoctoral F32 application? I would think it would help, actually.
No, it would help.
Fine.
Yeah. Okay.
What else?
All right, the next question. NIH allows MD, PhD students conducting research at adjunct facilities to apply and obtain fellowships. However, upon a fellow's return to medical school, a change of institution transfer is required. The standard transfer process and required forms aren't really applicable, as the research project and mentorship is completed at the point they transfer back to med school for clinical rotations. Yet the NIH still requires this type of transfer application.
That's a little bit more complex to deal with. So we might want to deal with it offline if you send me an email. It is also a question more properly directed at a grants management specialist. So program officers don't have as much experience in terms of transfer or suspension, transfer, termination, all of those things. So grants management specialists are much more aware of those things. So if you want to send me an email separately, I'll be happy to help you.
Okay, next question. Can you have a co-mentor from another institution?
Yes. And if it's beneficial to you, yes, definitely, yes.
Here's a question. I have some papers, first author for my PhD, but not Cell or Nature. Am I still competitive for an F32?
Yes.
Yes.
Are there strategies you can suggest for obtaining recent successful F32 fellowship applications?
Strategies for obtaining. So if you know other postdocs like Sam in your department, you can approach them. I think they'll be thrilled to share some information with you, including their summary statement, perhaps, and how they responded to the summary statement. I would say approach your mentor first, but approach colleagues. And ask them if they can show you. This is not something that NIH can actually divulge. We cannot give you examples of what is coming in.
But I think it's very important that if you're in a certain field, it's useful to get something that may be in that field because there's certain commonalities. But sometimes it's also useful to get something in an entirely different field so you get a sense of the overarching way people dealt with these issues, independent of the details of the research.
Here's a question for me. Somebody said, you said you had written a proposal before even joining the lab. How did I do this without having any preliminary data? And so I think that there's two things going in my favor. One is that I have had experience generally in the system in which I'm continuing my research. And the second is that I included preliminary data that was collected in the laboratory, just showing the basic feasibility of the projects that I was proposing. And so
That
that's
might or might not have worked in every case, just so you know. That some study sections would have said, we want to see that it depends. Every case is a little bit different, so, it worked.
there's another question. So if you've already a staff scientist, but still under 3 years post-PhD, is that going to be negatively impacting your application?
Depending on your institution, you may no longer be eligible for an NRSA grant because you have to be a postdoc, which is a different training status than a staff scientist.
I think that the question is, let's say you did your PhD, you graduated, you worked as a staff scientist for 3 years, and now you're beginning a postdoc.
And a new institution that it depends on what your job title is. If you're called a postdoc, you'll be eligible. If you're called a staff scientist, you probably wouldn't be. Henry, am I right?
You're correct. You should check with your Office of Sponsored Research if your mentor doesn't know, and usually department chairs and deans know. But Office of Sponsored Research can give you that information in terms of what you're eligible to apply for, depending on what your title is. So this is institutional policy.
I've just finished my graduate studies. Can I write a proposal without finding a lab in the United States?
No.
If you were on an F-31 grant during predoctoral training for 3 years, does that carry over at all and cut into your time for F-32 postdoctoral eligibility?
No.
No. These are separate. 5 years predoc, 3 years postdoc. Completely separate.
And this is going to be our last question. Does NRSA fund more theoretically oriented research when they are in a collaborative experimental lab?
Yes.
It can, sure.
No problem. Just make sure it's clear. For people writing theory proposals, clarity is very, very important. Because remember, most of the people who are likely to be reading and reviewing your grants may not be theorists. So they have to understand what the theory is going to bring to understanding a fundamental biological question.
I think even for the biological questions, saying exactly what kind of statistics you're going to be using to assess the experiment and being very clear about what one observation would mean for your theory versus another.
Clarity is always good. And make sure it's written in really, make sure there are no typos, no syntax errors, etc. Neatness counts. Make sure the figures are all readable, etc. I think we're more or less done.
So too.
We'd like to thank all of you for being there. We hope that you now know who to ask all the other questions you might have. All the really nitty-gritty ones about NIH, you should either address to the sponsored programs office at your home institution or to someone at NIH directly. And otherwise, just talk to your peers and your faculty members. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.